Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Haunted Locations. Today's episode takes us to Washington, D.C., and we're going to be discussing the Holmead's burial grounds. The Holmead's burial grounds, also known as the Holmead Cemetery and the Western Burial Grounds, was a historic cemetery located in the DuPont Circle neighborhood of Washington, D.C. It was founded by Anthony Holmead in 1794. Even though technically in the boundary of the city of Washington, D.C., for most of its history, Holmead Cemetery was essentially in a rural area of forest. There were almost no buildings around it, and there was only one road leading to it from downtown Washington, D.C. The first recorded burial occurred on May 29, 1794, when Robert Smith of Boston was buried in the northeast corner of the grounds. Other burials soon followed. On May 15, 1820, the city of Washington, D.C. took over the burial grounds. One thing the city added was a split rail fence with gates around it. The cemetery was also segregated by race, with a fence of thorn bushes separating the African American section from the rest of the burial grounds. Much of the land around the cemetery was sold for development by the early 1850s, and houses and other buildings began to be constructed on nearby city blocks. In the 1860s and 70s, the cemetery was filled beyond capacity. Burial plots often contained 3 or 4 bodies, with the uppermost coffin being just a foot or 2 below the surface. In 1871, the D.C. Board of Public Health declared the Holmead's burial ground a public nuisance. By this time, with unofficial burials included, it was believed to have had over 10,000 burials. By this point, the cemetery was filled beyond capacity. There was nowhere else for it to go. It was also not very well taken care of. Grass grew tall, weeds grew, coffins were even exposed because of the illegal burials. On March 6, 1874, D.C. declared that their cemetery be closed and that the process of removing bodies be started. And by December 22, 1884, all bodies had been removed. Now, this is about 10 years. So why did it take so long, and how did it go? Well, first of all, if you had a loved one and you wanted to move them and you had the money to do so, you could move them to another cemetery and do it respectfully. But for all the people that couldn't be contacted or that didn't have the money, all their loved ones were pretty much dug up and buried in mass graves. Now, these were done with 2 different cemeteries in D.C., the Graceland Cemetery if you were African American, and the Rock Creek Cemetery if you were another race, mostly white. And they pretty much just dug up as many bodies as they could, and they dumped them in these mass graves, kind of be forgotten about. A lot of these mass graves are just represented by numbers. They have no names. No one even knows really who is officially buried in them for a lot of them. So they were taken away very disrespectfully and kind of just forgotten about by history. Also, in 1881, the process of removing such a large number of remains was not well managed. Many coffins were left exposed, and a large number of empty graves were not filled in. A public scandal erupted in April when local children were seen playing with leg and arm bones and placing skulls on poles around the cemetery. But like I said, by 1884, December of 1884, all the bodies were removed, and the land was eventually sold. And in 1905, what is now the President Madison Apartments were built on the northwest corner of the square. As you can see in these pictures, this is what is there now. Pretty much houses. So I would expect people who have lived in these houses or live in them currently to have experienced some sort of paranormal activity. Because what happened on this land, if you were a spirit and you were still attached to your body, to be put to rest here and then just be dug up and moved, I think that would anger your spirit. You would be mad that someone would do that to you. So I have not been able to find any actual pictures of the cemetery when it existed, because I can't find any. I don't know if there's even any known photos. And also ghost stories, I have not, this is just speculation. I've not been able to find any evidence of paranormal activity here. But I think that there's so many people that move and come to DC and move and go and come and go, that they're not really going to share their stories online. I think a lot of people probably have stories here, and if you're watching this video because you live here or you have lived in this area and you have experienced any type of activity, please comment below. I would love to hear some stories from this place, to get some confirmation from someone who was around here. It's just a place I saw. It's a historical cemetery that I thought had a lot of history to it, and I figured there has to be some type of paranormal activity here. Now obviously I can't go investigate it myself. This is private property. You go around DC of cameras in certain places, people start thinking you're up to something, you know. But if you live here or you have lived here, like I said, please share your story. Also to note, this area in DC, it's now, you know, obviously it's now just as congested as downtown DC, you know, but back in the day it wasn't. Right across the street, as you can see in this alleyway, is the Washington Hilton Hotel. Now, if you don't know anything about the Washington Hilton, I'll tell you the one thing that happened there. That is where Ronald Reagan, while President of the United States, was shot. It's not technically on the cemetery property, but it's right across the street from the cemetery, literally just across the road is the sidewalk where Ronald Reagan was shot. So I think that's just interesting to have that historical significance so close to this spot. Oftentimes when I discovered the story of the Holmead Cemetery probably about 5 years ago while doing research, and whenever I would tell people about it, they never heard of it. And I would say, well, remember when Ronald Reagan was shot? And they say, yeah. I say, well, it was right across the street from the Washington Hilton where Ronald Reagan was shot. And people say, oh, okay. So as you can see in this picture, there's the Washington Hilton. You know, just very historical. And it's just very interesting knowing that there was once a massive 10,000 burial cemetery right here in this area. You know, just think about that. Think about removing all those bodies in the 1800s, digging by hand. But again, here's the Washington Hilton. That's the spot where Reagan was walking when he was shot. And then you can see here's a picture of Reagan right before he was shot, literally as he was walking to his car. So that area has some significance, like I was saying. But anyways, yeah, if you're ever in DC, I would definitely at least drive through here. I mean, I know it's private property, so you can't really go snooping around and looking for things. There's no plaques. There's nothing significant about it that has anything you can visit. But, you know, just to know what was here and just know that history of this place, I think it's very interesting. I hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoyed this. And if you already know about this and you're finding this video because you're trying to do research on it, I hope you can enjoy it too and understand that this is part of the history of Washington, D.C. And it's not really talked about a lot, but it definitely is a part of Washington, D.C. history. You really don't hear about something like this happening in this modern age. A big cemetery like this being dismantled and moved. But it happened in the 1800s, so definitely interesting to look back on. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. Until next time, this is Fixed Image saying peace.